So I think it's time we get started. Let me make sure that our speakers and audio input, that all looks good. Thanks for joining me today. Let's go ahead and switch over to the coding view. Get rid of that. We're going to take our project and add some APIs and fill out some of our other entities. And let's just go there. Let's go there. And then I'll introduce for the new viewers sort of what we're going for. Oh, good. Looks like everything's working right. So, in case you haven't watched this before, I'm building a website called Sight Read Code. Sight Read comes from the idea that in music there's a competition thing I did when I was a kid called sight reading, where they would give you some music. You had to look at it and figure out how it sounded, how fast it was, how loud it was, and play it. And I was particularly bad at this. But because of my history in software development, I became very good at reading code. Debuggers weren't very good for a very long time in my early career, and I think this is a skill that we're missing. So, what I'm trying to do is build a website where people can look at a random piece of code, comment on what they think it is, and then sort of create a community about other people discussing particular pieces of code. And we're going to eventually generate a bunch of these blocks of code. So we're going to need a few things. And one of the things that I did on the very first day was really talk about the kind of data we needed. And this was a very back of the napkin sort of thing. We need some code block that's a text of code, and then we want answers, so people that have explained it. We want responses to those answers, reactions to not really the code block, but really reactions to the answers and the responses, and then some way to flag that answers and responses have been read. Now, has read probably doesn't belong on its own. So whether it's been read or not probably belongs on its own, I should say, because this is going to be read per user, per person. So we have a few different pieces. It's a pretty simple data model, and we're going to start by just going and opening up our entities for this code block. And this is what we came up with originally. There's the code, there's the title to the code, and we have a primary key. That's probably sufficient for now. Let's go ahead and create an answer. Well, you must be up pretty late at Abhishek. I'm sure I butchered that name, but thanks for joining me again. I think I saw you last time. And I'm just going to mock up some data here before we start building the APIs. We're going to spend today pretty much all on the server side. So let's do an ID. And I should have done the whole prop thing. And an answer is going to have a answer text, let's say. I'm just thinking about this off the top of my head. And we need to know, what else do we need about the answer text? That might be it for now, because answer and response are going to be pretty similar. Answer text, we're going to need a code block ID. Now, I don't always set the IDs on the objects for my foreign keys, but in this case, I'm certainly going to do that. I'm also going to give it a navigation. Actually, I'm not going to give it a navigation. I like these things to be top down. We can always do the navigation later. Actually, in order for us to do the queries, we're going to need two things. We're going to first need public what is a virtual? There we are. Code block. And that'll point us to the code block that this answer belongs to. What doesn't like about that? And I also need a virtual, let's say I collection of answers. And I'm going to initialize this to a list of answer, just so we have a built-in collection there. Now, because we had created that, we've created this as answers, which is self-referencing, and that's not what I meant to do. I meant response. This name might get us into trouble later when we're writing the API, but probably not. And I'm going to just generate a new type in a new file. Let's change this to response as well. I'm going to navigate over F12 to our new file I created. And this is one of the ways I normally do these, is I go ahead and use creating of the new type, and then I follow it down, and I continue down until we have all the different pieces we're talking about. And so this is going to have a required string for response text. I could probably make that less verbose, but that should do for now. And this is going to have a public integer, which is going to be the answer ID. And then, like we saw before, we're going to have a virtual answer here that I will call answer, right? Oh, and we need to make that required. And so if we go back and look at our data model or our README where I've done this, so we have code block, answers, responses, reactions, and at some point we're going to need to create two more entities. And so now let's think about how we would do this, because we really need the idea of a user, and I'd rather use a principal for that, because I'd rather not invent or build my own authentication. I'd rather use authentication that implies another user. And so I'll probably just use, instead of an entity for the user, I probably will only use the ID for that user. So let's go back to the answer first. And here, let's go ahead and give it a required string, string for user ID. Now this probably be a GUID based on, let's say, Azure Aspire, I'm sorry, not Azure Aspire, Azure ID, Azure AD, whatever they're calling it these days. Though it could be used, the Facebook GUID or whatever it is, but some string that identifies that user. We may need to refactor this later, and I'm going to actually because we're not going to do our identity yet, I'm going to allow for it in the data model, but I'm not going to use it quite yet. We're just going to assume that the current person is the current user. We'll go back, and when we add authentication, we'll do that. So we have two more pieces here, and these are going to be not related to these, but we'll be able to look them up. So let's create the reaction. Flatten that. That'll be an ID for the reaction. Required string. And this will be some sort of string representation of the string icon. That may be just the Unicode description, or maybe something that we set up as our standard reactions. I'm going to leave it as a string to just sort of deal with it. And we're going to need an integer for, let me think about this. Do we need a reaction for answers and responses? And if so, how do we handle that? Because I think what we need are two pieces. One is the an ID for target ID, and that this may be the answer or the reaction. We could even do this for code block if we need to, but I want it to be a little fluid. And then here I'm gonna create a required string for target type. Now I might do this as an enum later, but I'm not really concerned with it yet. And we're not going to make this relationship navigable because we have this odd binding, and we certainly could do some entity framework magic to make this work. But for now, I just want to get to the API, so I want sort of the first pass at this. And so I'm also going to add the read flag or red flag, depending on how you want to deal with that. Oh, I forgot that we're also going to need who did this as well. And we're going to need who did the read flag, and then we'll do the same thing we did over here and have a target and target type. Some of you watching this now or later may go, there's a better way to do this, and there might be, but for now I'm going to leave it as that, because all this is going to be is a simple bool, right? Have they read it, haven't they read it, etc. And for consistency, I'm going to move that there. So we have our data model. Now we've got migrations that we had added earlier, and we had this site reading context in order to deal with those. So we're going to need to add some DB sets here because we're going to model up the database in a minute. And so this is going to be answer for answers, and answer again, and then responses, response, read flag, read flags, and read flags, and finally reactions. And so we have the DB context. Let's go ahead and open up our PowerShell. And let's first build it. Just make sure I haven't screwed up the building. I could have certainly just done Control-Shift-B as well. But so I'm going to use the Entity Framework migrations, add new entities as the name. Because we built it, I'm going to try to make this quicker by saying no build. And of course, I need to go to the right project. And so you will see now in the migrations, there's a second set called new entities, and this will have all our data in it. And so we could do database update, and it'll move it to that. But let's actually create a third migration, though we could delete this whole thing and rerun the migrations from the beginning, because I'm just going to need some sample data. So let's do override on model creating, and I'm going to let it create the model as it sees fit, but I want to add some things. So I'm going to say, I just like to rename this to builder. Old school, but, and for, let's say, the entity code block, I want to add has data. This is going to allow us to inject in some data. Hi from Austria. Thanks for joining us. Ooh, 10 people watching. I've only been doing this a little time, so this is probably, you know, a high for me. So has data, I'm just going to say new code block here. And these aren't injected where it'll assign the IDs. When we do this injection, it actually needs the actual data. So I'm going to say ID equals 1. What doesn't like about that? Oh, I can't just use. Someone's been doing JavaScript the last couple days. You can tell. So I'm going to use the array indexer just to create a couple of these. So I used to doing some of these as demos that I'm like, feels like I don't want to be doing all this typing, but I really do. Required member must be set. Oh, okay, yeah. We're just not there yet. And so the code, I'm going to go ahead and initialize it that way. And then title, sample code block, just so we have some data in there. And so in the code, if you remember in the first API that we wrote, or the, did we actually do any of this? Yeah, I think we did it here in program. Oh, we have code block in there, but it was just returning empty, I think. So let's just create a quick new block that just says public class program. This isn't actual code that's going to be run. Got ahead of myself. Public static int main. Return -1, right? So we just have a stupid pieces of code there, and make sure this is an equal, not a colon, because I get that all the time. And so we're creating just some sample data here. And we could do, we can go ahead and add answers and flags and all of that as we actually build up the API. So that's probably good enough for us to get started. And let's build it again. And then finally, I'll update the database for all the migrations. Now notice that we got yet another point of the sample data is in there as a migration. Remember, you can always remove these and then add them back. Of course, it should have been no build there as well. It did it, and we can see now that we have a local database. I think I put it in here. This now has all the tables we wanted, and if we look at code blocks, there's our one piece of little code, right? So we're all good. We've got data, and we can move on from that to the API. And so let's talk about how I want to actually handle this. I have this site read code.api.http that we could do all this modeling in, but I'm actually going to create a new directory that I'm going to call HTTP tests, and I'm going to create one for code block.http. So, and I'm just going to take this code, because this is really the first thing we're going to be doing. I'm just going to throw it in here. And what I usually like to do before I build the API, how are we doing time? Ooh, burnt through a lot of it, is look and figure out what I want the API to look like. So I'm going to take this and just rename it to host, just so we don't have to get into these long things. We can really focus on what it is at the end. If you haven't used HTTP files before, there's just a text file that you can use to run requests. And so if we actually run this project, because we do have one API already written, and we do send request, we can see it's now returning that actual data. You'll notice the RNs because we're putting in breaks. Now that might need to be handled with just ends or whatever, but for now that's good. So let's talk about some of our others. So we're going to want get, and I'll go ahead and put the host back in here later. Code by ID. I'm also going to want to get, I'm also going to want to post API. I'm actually going to change this to be code block random, so we get a random one when we need one. And let me pluralize that. And this shouldn't surprise you that this is how I sort of think through building the API. And I want to do that ahead of time. I don't create APIs on the fly, right? We want to really look and see what our API looks like, and then we can start to build it. So code blocks. And notice when I'm building the APIs, I'm very specifically saying I want these to be entities, right? I want these to be a way of defining a path. So code blocks / random is a specific story. Code blocks should return all of the objects, etc. And these shouldn't be except because, oh yeah, they should. But here we're going to actually tell it that we want it to be content type application. I always spell application wrong. And here we can actually go ahead and build what one of our content looks like. Luckily, we already have one. So I'm just going to copy this over here. And in our case, we don't need to set the ID because we don't know what the ID is. And another block. I'm already seeing that we probably need to have the idea of language in here. So I might make the change as we do this, but I'll just go ahead and say console.log foo as our piece of code here. And so let's, as I'm working through this, I'm often going to go back and forth. So public required string language. And these I'm going to use as the shortened versions that we, actually I'll say language code. Because there is a default language style here that can be used when you're doing it in markup or you're using it in other places to specify what kind of code this is. And so let's go back to our context and let's add language code equals CS for C#, right? And so what are we going to do? Let me stop this for a minute. Let's go ahead and make our data correct again, and let's say .NET EF migrations remove. I think it's remove. Ah, that's right. Because we're pointing it at a specific database, let's go ahead and say .NET EF database drop, because we haven't put anything in it, and should have said no build again. Yes, I want to delete it. Let's go ahead and remove that migration. All that did was revert back up one. You'll notice it disappeared here from the migrations. And I'm going to go ahead and now re-add the initial data or whatever we called it. And interesting. I didn't realize where it was. Let's see if that actually fixes it or breaks it. Never had that happen where it didn't find it in the right place before. Let's go ahead and update the database and see if it actually works. Actually, I don't think it did because I haven't. Because I actually haven't, I forgot to build it. Let's go ahead and update it, but this time make sure it builds so we get the brand new version. And this is a spot check. Let's take a look at the columns. There's the language code. Okay, we're good. So I'm going to close everything but this. So we can go back here, and here we're just going to say language, code, and it's going to be JS in this case, right? Let's go ahead and say API code blocks 1. We're going to do very much the same thing, but because we're going to expect the ID, I'm going to go ahead and say 1 here as well. Just change that a tiny bit, and then delete, right? All this should be vaguely familiar. And let's go ahead and put that host before each one of these. This doesn't give you the little send request until it has a valid URL for each of these. So we've got our code block API, and let's go ahead and create it. Let's see how we're doing in time. Yeah, we should have plenty of time. I'm going to use this to sort of work through the API as I'm doing it. Eventually, probably next week, we'll start to write tests against these. But let's see how I'm doing it. I told you I'm going to be using minimal APIs, and in fact, I already have one minimal API here. But of course, it doesn't work because I've changed the way the URL works. So I'm just going to comment that out for now, because what I'm going to do instead is create a folder for APIs, and I'm going to call this my code blocks API class. So this is going to start to look a lot like controllers, and feel free to use controllers on your own as well. There's a reason I'm doing it this way, and you'll see in a minute what that looks like. I'm going to bring in a dependency, .NET add package. I could do this with the package manager, obviously. And I'm going to add a package called Wilderminds .discovery. So I wrote this little package called Minimal API Discovery to make this all a little easier. Actually uses code generation, source generation, what do they call it? Source generators. To make this work. And essentially it exposes an interface called IAPI. And when I implement that interface, all we do is get a call for register. And the idea here is pretty simple. I'm going to write the APIs in here because I'm being given a builder, and I could just map get, map post like we would in those, but I'm actually going to do a map group because I want my group to start with API code blocks, right? And from that group, I can map get, and because it's just code API blocks, I can go ahead and put it in quotes, and then I could request the site read context. Let's see. I called it that. Did I just call it site context? Nope. What did I call it? I know all of you, or the 9 of you watching, site reading context. And I'm just going to call context.codeblocks to list. Right? Nice and simple. And what happens is, because I've written this over in programs, I can just call app.mapAPIs. just build it once. This is where the code generator, I'm probably doing something wrong in the code generator. And there it is. I couldn't find the namespace for some reason for me. But this is going to go and essentially register all these APIs for me. There's no service requirements for this. And this doesn't use service injection at all. It just simply finds the registers and calls them for you. So you'll have to trust me. So if we've done this right, I'm going to change this so it doesn't launch the browser anymore. Let's go ahead and run this. And let's go back to our code block here and let's see if our request works. And interestingly, it's returning an empty collection. So the API worked, but let's see if our sample data never got in here. Nope, never did. I wonder why. So if we look at these new entities, that's our initial data. That is strange. Oh, it was supposed to build it. Let's rebuild it again. And let's just make sure that this did what it's supposed to do. Database is already up to date. We had to move this in, and I wonder if that means it's not part of the same piece. It's where the Entity Framework migrations can really cause me a lot of pain. So I've recreated it, I've updated it, and it looks like it was going to add the data. Let's go ahead and run this. I'm not sure exactly what went wrong. Probably not running the build when I did the migration caused some issue. And over in my code blocks, let me pin that so I can get at it. Nope, that's not the pin. There's the pin I want. Why isn't it getting a data? Let me make sure there's still no data in here. View data. That's very strange. There's my has data, but it never gets it anywhere. So let's see if we can fix this. I know it's supposed to be all about APIs, but sometimes it just gets annoying. Let's build it. Let's drop that database, and I'm gonna start migrations all the way over. Just delete it. You've been seeing movement on my second screen here because I'm looking to see if there's questions, but the movement is actually me actually just writing code. So it's I'm not great at this yet. Try rebuilding the database. Probably not the last time we'll do this. And let's see now. Sample data is there. Okay. I don't know what went wrong, but let's go ahead and run this. And we're finally somewhere we want to be. Okay, great. A few more minutes. We probably won't get through this whole API yet, but I'm going to create another get for ID, and I'm going to tell it that I want an integer. And so because I'm putting it here, it's going to append it onto the map group. I don't need an extra slash in beginning or anything. And I'll do the same thing I did here. Not brilliant, but it should be good enough. And here I'm going to see if I can find the code blocks. And here I'll need to inject that ID as well, and then I'll just say find async await, which of course means we need to do async. Oh, and let's do that up here as well. I don't like to do any of this synchronously inside of APIs. Let me guess that needs a namespace. Yep. And then here's where I'm going to start to use the results a little more. If results equal is null, then I'm going to return results.not found. Else I'm going to return results.ok. And I'm going to rename this to result because I don't like the way it looks. Let's go ahead and run it again. I should be able to go right back to my HTTP here and come down here into my send request. And we're getting that same one. So we have it. What happens if we change this to get a second one? That will get not found, right? We get the basic idea of what we need it to do. There's nothing else that really could happen. We might need to deal with that as another piece. So in our API, I'm going to add some things to this. I'm going to say produces I forget where this is. These are some these are ways to add things that it actually apply to just this API. You can do the same up here. Like later, we'll actually do require authorization when we have authorization turned on, and then the entire API becomes requires authentication. No, in the case of code blocks, we're probably going to allow it to be open. So instead of fixing those, let's talk about, as we start to build this, this becomes a pretty terse piece of code and is really hard to test, right? And so what I'm going to do actually, I'm going to eliminate this, and I'm going to tell it to get all, and I'm going to have it generate a method called get all. And all I'm going to do is make this method public, static, and then of course a stack that returns an I result. I forgot to say async. Lots of little words there. The idea behind this really is that I'm going to later be able to write tests by just calling get all. I don't have to do a lot of the, in order to unit test this, I don't need to do a lot of the boilerplate of building a context like you could do, like you could do with what's the word I'm looking for? With controllers, where you need to sort of build up all the infrastructure around that controller in order to do it. In this case, I just need to be able to inject these site read context in our case, which is something that's well known and simple to do. And let's do it with this one as well. Get one. Wish there was a little better way to refactor this, but should be good for now. And this is going to return a task of iResult. Oh, I have to have a name. Get one. There we go. Same body, but again, now I can. What did I just do? I just did all the wrong things. I just replaced all my get all here. So this is what I was trying to replace. Result. And let's get rid of the lambda. And then the body becomes the same. So the idea here, sorry for scratching my ear, the idea here is that I'm building up these APIs. I'm letting the registration handle the big piece, and I can just go ahead and see, oh, this is what all the API is, and then when I want to drill into these, just like we would do with controllers. I was hesitant to move away from controllers, but one, the plumbing involved here is smaller and relies more on code generation than it does reflection, which is a good thing, especially if you're looking at AOT builds. The other is that finding this pattern of being able to much simpler, of writing tests that are much simpler than we could with controllers really appeals to me. So let's add another map get random, right? We have that random one. Get random. Go ahead and implement that. And when I'm not refactoring it, this becomes even easier, right? Because then I can just say public static async iResult. And we just need that context. So one of the things you may think is, well, why don't we make these non-static and then inject it at the class level? We certainly could do that, but I don't think we're gaining a lot by having it stay around. Because what ultimately happens is that when these are registered, it's registering these function or these method pointers, but the code class API is really only needed in itself as a type during startup. We're never reinstantiating this over and over again. And so by leaving the injection at the method level, I think it makes it a little simpler. So there used to be a way to do this. Let's see if I can figure this out. So if we take the context and let's say code blocks, order by, I think that was the trick, to just give it a random GUID and then first async. So it'll return us the first one. And then we can say return results.ok result. That should be only one. Now what doesn't look about here? Oh, I should probably await this. There we go. So let's restart it. I don't trust the restart we had before. So let's see if we're getting our code blocks. We are. We can go ahead and get a single one. In random, hopefully we'll just return, obviously, one, because we only have one now. But we'll come back and revisit and test this once we get post built. We have about 5 minutes. I think we can get post built, because this should be pretty simple. Now these may be refactored later to use something like a repository pattern or something like that, but I'm going to do it pretty brute forced at this point. So it's going to have the same URL because we're adding an item to the code block collection, and I'll just call this one create, generated method create. We'll do some of our fancy little changes. We could also change this later to not accept the entities, but some model instead, and use mapping and get into all of that. I don't know if this small app needs it, but we're going to see. Hey, Richard, nice to see you. And Zaki said message retracted. Okay. Well, glad to see you, Zaki, even if it's not exactly what you want. So code, block, and I'm going to say model. Eventually, we will bring in validation. So we might not get to test next week. We might continue to build this over the next couple, including introducing validation. But let's go ahead and say context.codeblocks add. So we're going to assume it's going to be right this first time. So I'm going to add to the model. And then I'm going to say if await context.save changes async is greater than 0. Now what is that? Save changes actually returns the number of rows affected. And if this create doesn't actually save anything, I'm going to consider it just as if it had an error, right? If it doesn't save anything, we have a problem. But if we have at least one row affected, then we can say return created, results created. And created has some others like created at routes, which obviously we're not using routing, and created based on a certain value, which will actually do that because the first parameter is the URI and the second is just going to be the model. Now they just sent us the model. Why send us the model back? That's because the database might be doing changes, and in this case that change is likely to be specifying the ID, right? And so we'll get a model with the correct ID with it this time. And so for now I'm just going to do this by hand and say API code blocks model.id. Again, we're going to use that model ID to specify what it was, what it created as well. Now, when these get more complicated, here I'm going to actually say there's a problem. Could not save code block. That'll be good enough. Because this because we're updating this model, we should just be able to see this actually work. So let's restart it again. I will give you a very quick tip. If you like the way I have the stop and restart and everything on the left, you can go up here and say to customize the menu bar, and any of these like debug, you can say what location is, and I always move it to the left. So hopefully that is worth the entire, yes, we want to stop debugging, the entire cost of entry to this. So let's see if it works. And if it works, then we can probably break for today. So let's go ahead and send this request. And it did not like, oh, because I'm extra nested. Let's try that again. User error instead. And there we have our second, right? And so if we go ahead and send the request for all the blocks, we should see them both being created. If we get a random one, we should get 2 occasionally. Maybe not. Probably need to revisit that code next time. Send the request for the 1, and let's make sure the 2 works as well. So we're in pretty good shape, right? We have a few more things to do here. We have a few more APIs to write, but I think this is a good go. Thanks everyone for coming. I really do appreciate it. I'm just going to switch back over to my full camera. And hope you've learned some things in this. I'm certainly learning how to not be frightened coding in front of people, a whole project where I don't have it planned out. You know, feel free in the comments to this to tell me where you think I should be improving or things I should be doing that you don't like. Because I'd like to have that conversation about this off-the-cuff developing of a website and whether it's a good idea or, you know, I want to learn with every project I'm using, and that means getting feedback from you all will be a big help. Thanks for watching again. This has been Sean Wildermuth for Code.